I think you all know the answer to that.
I don't know where to begin. We are North Americans, and for those of you who still think we're from England, we're not. So,
hello again, Internet. Hello again, world. Hello again, Jason Isaacs. We're talking about Congress, and of course, what's the big problem with Congress? It's Congress, or as LCD System Sound System was saying, North American scum. That's a bit harsh, but hey, this is a great track.
But if we act all shy, it'll make it okay. It makes it go away. Oh, I don't know where to begin. When we're North American.
Well, what I've tried to do here is to follow the same basic structure as I had with my presentation from the other day. We're going to divide and rule. We're going to take Congress and divide it into manageable chunks because it's very, very big. The key thing with Congress, I think, is that the important relationships are all within Congress. Yeah, there's lots of important things that go on outside it. You need to know about the relationship between Congress and the President, and of course, Congress and the Supreme Court, and Congress and interest groups and all of that. But the real problem with Congress is very, very simply Congress. And so you need to know Congress. You need to know about your committees in the House, the Ways and Means and the Rules Committee, in the Senate, the Foreign Affairs Committee, and the Judiciary. You need to know about committee chairs. You need to know about the officers, the House, the Speaker, the Minority Leader, the whips to a certain extent, and of course in the Senate, the Minority and Majority Leader. You also need to know about power distribution, House versus Senate, and the big question there, who's the daddy? So those are the objects, and you need to know why they matter and how they shape Congress and why they make Congress the monumental foster clock that it is. Now, as I said earlier, when it comes to the relationship between objects, the real question there is why doesn't Congress work? There is another question, which is foreign policy, and we've kind of touched on that in other presentations, so I'm not going to go into that in a huge amount of detail. I do touch on it later in this presentation. But we'll worry about that when the time comes. Let's just get rid of Mr. LCD Sound System for a second. Right, so the key thing then is these long questions, dividing and ruling as we did with the President. And I've done it in a slightly different way this time. I said, well, what does Congress do? What's Congress's job? And this is described by the Constitution. You can go back to the Constitution. It will tell you that it has domestic roles and foreign roles. And those roles are to legislate. That includes power of the purse. I've bundled that into legislation. Also, they're there to scrutinize. There's a general scrutiny role which goes all the way up to and including impeachment. And then there's the specific advice and consent obligations that are expected of the Senate. And then, of course, there's representation. There's the idea that they are there to represent the citizens, and we have this the stratification of representation in the United States, which is great because it doesn't cause any problems at all. Okay. Foreign, well, again, I've divided it into fighting and talking, and you should know that when it comes to fighting, they declare war, and of course, that is the Constitution. You've also got the War Powers Act, which I haven't really gone into here in any great detail because it's redundant anyway. And of course, the power of the purse, which you should know is in effect much, much more important when it comes to keeping tabs on the Commander-in-Chief. In terms of talking, we've got the advice and consent role that accrues to the Senate, and the trade and aid role, the wider legislative role there that is trade and aid, and the way in which that can be used to advance the congressional agenda, such as there is or is not a congressional agenda, of which more later. Checks on Congress, well, pretty straightforward. Domestically, we've got the president who has the veto. I've put executive orders there. They're not really a check on Congress. It's a way of the president trying to get around it. And we should know by now that really congressional legislation is so much more powerful than executive orders. But I've just put them there because it looked lonely. Then we've got SCOTUS, judicial review, and by remaining independent and neutral, we know perfectly well that the Congress will often find itself on the wrong end of SCOTUS judgments. And moving across in terms of foreign affairs, well, the president is commander-in-chief. It can be quite hard to control your commander-in-chief, particularly if he doesn't declare war and he has sufficient funds and cojones to go off and fight these things through military action. In terms of talking, well, the president is chief diplomat. Congress might want to have one agenda. The president might want to have another agenda. And this is what I was talking about earlier. I'm not going to go into this in great detail, but of course, the fantastic evidence here to support that is the Boland Amendment and the way in which Congress and the president came virtually to blows over the business in Nicaragua. And we can see it again at present with the Iranian negotiations, where the president is heading off in one direction and Congress is tearing itself apart, not knowing which particular direction to go in terms of shaping relationships with Iran. And again, Cuba, the president has said, right, enough of you guys, I'm going to do this, and he's done that. And Congress is way behind on Cuba and on Iran. But you will have to look at my story files on that. There are lots of them out there. I'm not going to go into them right now because this is a broad overview. I don't want to get dragged into the weeds that are foreign policy right now. Veto over trade and aid, of course, that's legislation. So I can't think of a specific example of that off the top of my head. But again, I put it in there because it will be relevant. In fact, the president did threaten to veto any legislation extending Iranian sanctions in those negotiations. So yeah, we do have evidence there. And SCOTUS judicial review. I'm not quite sure congressional legislation being declared unconstitutional, largely because it only really applies within the United States. But anyway, let's move on. So what is the problem with Congress? And again, divide and rule. And this is how I've chose to do it. This time, ask me another time, I may do it a different way. It doesn't really matter as long as you have some sort of system to your approach. So what do I mean by design? What do I mean by unhappy accident? Well, what I mean is some things were meant not to work. Other things just haven't worked. And again, I've divided and ruled again. I've broken it down into legislation. So what is the problem with legislation? If we're looking at design, well, the short answer is the internal structures are ridiculously complicated and duplicated. So I'm looking here at House and Senate, and I'm looking at all the congressional committees within that. The structure is Byzantine. It's incredibly complicated. And the internal mechanisms, the procedures are Sisyphean. I mean, they just go on and on and on and on. However many 14 stages or 17 stages to pass a bill, 11 veto gates. These things are designed not to work. It's too complicated to work effectively. You couldn't sit down and design it. It's even more complicated than cricket and less intuitive. So in terms of legislation, the legislative process was deliberately dysfunctional. And then in addition to that, we've got the external checks in the shape of both the president and SCOTUS. SCOTUS not really, of course, by design, because they assumed the role of judicial review, but we'll worry about that another time. But they are external checks that operate on the Congress to make its life that much more difficult. In terms of scrutiny, what's the problem with scrutiny in terms of design? Well, they've got limited options. Really, the only real weapon in the arsenal is impeachment. They can create a stink and they can jump up and down and they can demand somebody's head, but they can't force anyone to bring them the head on the platter. They don't have power of agency, much like in the UK. However, they do have the power of impeachment, and that can be relevant. They can impeach senior public officials for high crimes and misdemeanors, including but not limited to the President and the Supreme Court. In terms of representation, the only design problem I think that we've got there is fear, specifically fear of the tyranny of the majority, and that leads to a democracy overdose. There are too many competing representative systems which lead to overlap and constant campaign and just a bloody great mess, frankly. But I think the real problem, of course, here is on the other side of the equation when we're looking at the unhappy accidents. We take a situation that doesn't kind of work, and then, wouldn't you know, things just get an awful lot worse. So in terms of legislation, we've got the struggle for control, specifically the struggle for control of Congress between committee chairs and party leaders. The whys and the wherefores are moot. They're fascinating. Do go and look into them. But what we need to know is that committee chairs used to control Congress. They used to get things done. Yes, it was not pretty. It was not happy. Parties didn't particularly like it because they were playing second fiddle, and the Republican Party knew that it was fighting a losing demographic battle, and so it had to gain control of Congress and start to force its own specific agenda on Congress. Except that didn't work. And then to make matters worse, we've got this party polarization, the way in which the parties just have no common ground. There is very, very little in terms of overlap, and what's worse, they are just diametrically opposed, and they will just refuse to agree on anything. In terms of scrutiny, well, we know the question of war that we've talked about at great length is no longer relevant. So that whole process of Congress declaring war, scrutinizing action through the declaration of war, that's no longer relevant at all. And I talked about Annabelle's party in the previous presentation. I'm not going to do it again here because I'm running out of time. But war is no longer relevant. We have instead military action, and that creates just a morass of confusion. And it makes it very, very difficult for Congress to do its job properly. The other thing about scrutiny generally, here again, impeachment and other sorts of things, and the committee reports, Dianne Feinstein's report on CIA activities in Guantanamo, for example. This is all about politics. It's not about governance. People are using this to score political points, and why? Because the constant campaign means they haven't really got the time to do anything else. Everything needs to be seen through the prism of politics rather than governance. It's all about what's going to get me votes. They're too busy to do this properly, and scrutiny is not really a likely vote winner. It doesn't generate huge returns at the box office. In terms of representation, gerrymandering undermines the representative function, party polarization undermines the representative function, and primaries undermine the representative function again. Now, this is all Unit 3. This is where you can bring your Unit 3 knowledge to bear. The electoral system was designed badly, but it's got an awful lot worse by virtue of gerrymandering, party polarization, and the primary. So, what does this lead us to conclude? It leads us to conclude that Congress is designed not to work, but it's not designed to work this badly. And it's worth asking the questions why. Well, the reason why Congress was designed not to work was because the Founding Fathers didn't want it to get too powerful. This is the power of the government and, of course, the power of the majority. This is the big democratic entity. If this is too powerful, then it's going to exercise the powers that one would associate with the tyranny of the majority, or alternative with the tyranny of government. So it was all about managing power. But it was also about ensuring that the primacy of the states was respected, that the states remained the foremost organization of political activity within the United States, that the federal government wasn't trampling over the rights and the integrity and the individuality of the states. That was the general idea, and so we were supposed to have a reduced role for central government. Of course, the problem is that the role of federal government and the expectations of federal government have expanded dramatically. What's expected of the federal government now is huge. And that hasn't been reflected in constitutional change. Off the top of my head, the only one we can really come up with is the 16th Amendment, which allowed Congress to levy an income tax. Congress could not levy an income tax until 1913, which is an extraordinary thing when you think about it. So the changing role and the changing expectations of Congress have not been reflected in constitutional change, and as a result of which they can't get anything done. It shouldn't really surprise anyone. We then have the struggle for congressional control, the idea that we had a system that worked, albeit badly, but it didn't serve the interests of parties, so they ripped that out and they replaced it with another system that simply doesn't generate the compromise, the coordination, and the cooperation that is required for overcoming these problems here. If you've got these problems here, everyone needs to be pulling in the same direction here if they're going to get over that. And of course, because we've got party polarization, that just ain't going to happen. So this is it. Congress is designed not to work, but it's not designed to work this badly. And if you can get your head around that, then absolutely super. These links will help you. This is the famous video, Why Does Congress Suck? This great video here from John Green. And this is my own Congress Explained, and this is one of a series of presentations on Congress. I'm going to see, I've got 10 seconds, so maybe you can pause and read this, but it's really just more of the same. Questions to the usual address. Happy to do tutorials. Good luck. Bye.